Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really significant and pretty complex issue that's been dominating headlines.
Yeah.
Recent developments and the different perspectives around U.S. immigration enforcement, and especially potential large-scale deportation efforts.
It certainly is. It's an area with just immense practical, economic, and social implications. And the sources you've shared, well, they give us a really multifaceted look at what's being discussed and proposed.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've pulled from quite a diverse stack of material. Everything from detailed research reports, like from the Pew Research Center, the American Immigration Council, the Urban Institute.
Right. Serious research outfits.
To news analysis from outlets like the Economic Times and Fox News, insights from groups like Clinic, and even a specific analysis tracking the first 100 days of a recent administration.
Yeah, and our mission here, just to be clear, isn't to weigh in or, take a side. We really just want to be your guides through all this material.
Right.
We want to sort of distill the key facts, the figures, the reported impacts that are highlighted across these varied sources, really just helping you become well-informed on what's clearly a rapidly evolving topic.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We should probably start by looking at what the sources actually say about the stated goals and the reported actions regarding increasing deportations.
That's good.
One figure that keeps coming up in the sources, and it's often attributed to figures like Stephen Miller, is this really ambitious goal: deporting 1 million immigrants per year.
And what's striking when you see that number, you have to compare it historically, right? The sources point out that total ICE removals under the previous Trump administration, they peaked at just over 267,000 in fiscal year 2019.
Okay.
Now, removals under former President Biden did increase significantly to over 271,000 in fiscal year 2024. But the sources are quick to note that these were overwhelmingly rapid border removals.
So not necessarily interior enforcement.
Exactly. Not the kind of interior enforcement implied by mass deportations from within the country. So, aiming for 1 million annually. That represents a scale several times larger than any recent historical peaks for that type of removal.
Right. So the report suggests this would be a completely unprecedented level of interior enforcement. And some sources do mention a slightly more realistic goal, maybe, also reportedly being considered, around 600,000 removals per year.
Still huge, though.
Still massive, yeah. The sources emphasize that even 600,000 is a massive increase over previous averages for interior removal specifically.
And that scale then leads directly to the question of, well, where would this enforcement effort focus? The sources highlight a presidential directive specifically calling to expand efforts to detain and deport immigrants living in the U.S. illegally in America's largest cities.
And the directive explicitly names Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York as targets. Now, it's important we note the rationale that's presented for targeting these specific cities, especially as reported in some of the sources, particularly outlets like Fox News and the Economic Times, is framed in, well, quite strong terms.
Yeah, how do they put it?
They describe these cities as, and this is a direct quote from those sources, where millions upon millions of illegal aliens reside.
Okay.
And the phrasing in those specific sources goes further. They portray these cities as, again, quoting the sources, the core of the Democrat power center, where they use illegal aliens to expand their voter base, cheat in elections, and grow the welfare state, robbing good-paying jobs and benefits from hardworking American citizens.
Right. And just to reiterate, that specific language, that's how the stated rationale is presented in those particular sources we're drawing from. Our role here is simply to reflect the perspectives and language used in the sources themselves, without endorsing them one way or the other.
Absolutely. And alongside these goals, the administration has also reported successes from its perspective. The first 100 days analysis, for instance, points to historically low border encounters being highlighted as evidence of effective policy.
Like what kind of numbers?
Well, for example, March 2025 reportedly saw just over 7,000 southwest border apprehensions, 7,181 to be exact, which is claimed as a 95% decrease from March 2024.
Wow, okay. That same analysis also details some pretty aggressive actions, like a reported military mission to essentially seal the southern border using something called NSPM-4.
NSPM-4? What's that?
It's a National Security Presidential Memorandum, and it reportedly grants the Department of Defense jurisdiction over certain federal lands, like the Roosevelt Reservation, specifically to establish what they call national defense areas.
And the purpose of that is?
The sources say it's to facilitate rapid infrastructure development and detention capabilities right there near the border.
Okay, so we've looked at the ambitious stated goals, some reported actions aimed at increasing deportations, boosting border control, all drawn directly from the sources. But what about the public? How do people view these kinds of policies? Let's turn to the Pew Research Center data for that.
Yeah, Pew gives us a pretty clear snapshot of where Americans stand, or at least where they stood when the survey was done. Roughly one-third of U.S. adults, that's 32%, say all immigrants living in the country illegally should be deported, period.
Okay, one-third for all. What about the other side?
At the other end, 16% say none should be deported, which leaves about half, 51% in the middle, saying at least some should face deportation.
Okay, so for that half who favor deporting some, who exactly are they thinking of? Does Pew break that down?
It does, and the sources show that nearly all of that group, a really striking 97%, support deporting those who have committed violent crimes. That seems to be, a near universal point of agreement among those who support some deportations.
Makes sense. But what about beyond violent crime?
Well, that's where support drops off significantly. Views get much more divided when it comes to deporting those who have committed nonviolent crimes. Only about half, 52% of that middle group support that.
Okay.
And even fewer, 44%, favor deporting those who simply arrived in the U.S. within the past 4 years.
And the sources also emphasize that far fewer still favor deporting people who have family ties here in the U.S. So it seems like while about half support some deportations, the public draws pretty clear lines on who they think should be prioritized or maybe exempted.
Exactly. And Pew's research also explores another really crucial dimension where immigration arrests should actually be allowed to take place. This gets into enforcement presence in community spaces,
Right, like sensitive locations. What does the data show there?
It shows strong public consensus against arrests in certain places.
Yeah.
Majorities of Americans, according to this data, say arrests should not happen in places of worship. 65% oppose it. Similarly, majorities say arrests should not happen in schools, 63% oppose, and hospitals, 61% oppose. Those seem to be pretty widely seen as sort of off-limit zones for enforcement.
But conversely, people are okay with arrests in other settings.
Yes, majorities say arrests should be allowed in other places. The data shows 66% support arrests at protests or rallies, 63% support them happening in people's homes, and 54% support them in workplaces.
What's fascinating here, though, and the Pew data really highlights this, are the huge partisan differences on these questions about where arrests should happen. The gap is just stark.
How stark are we talking?
Take arrests at protests or rallies. 89% of Republicans think that should be allowed, compared to just 44% of Democrats.
Wow, that's a massive difference.
Isn't it? And it's similar for arrests in homes. 84% of Republicans support them versus, again, 44% of Democrats.
And I bet places of worship show a big gap, too.
The biggest gap, actually. 52% of Republicans say arrests should be allowed there, compared to a mere 15% of Democrats. The sources just make it crystal clear that public opinion on where enforcement happens is deeply polarized along party lines.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've covered the stated goals, some actions, public opinion. But if the goal really is mass deportations on the scale being discussed, what do the sources say about the practical side? What would it actually take in terms of logistics and, importantly, cost?
Yeah, this is where that American Immigration Council report provides some really eye-opening estimates.
What do they project?
Well, they dive deep into the estimated fiscal realities. They estimate the annual cost of a longer-term mass deportation operation, one targeting that 1 million people per year figure, would average $88 billion annually.
$88 billion a year. That's a staggering figure.
It is. And over the projected duration, more than a decade, the cumulative cost is estimated to total close to $968 billion. Almost $1 trillion.
Wow. So what drives costs that high? It can't just be like plane tickets out of the country, can it?
No, not at all. The sources break down several key drivers, and they paint a picture of needing to build just massive amounts of new infrastructure.
Like what?
Like detention capacity. To detain people while they're processed for deportation at that kind of scale, the report estimates you'd need to build and maintain 24 times more ICE detention capacity than it currently exists.
24 times. How would you even do that?
Well, the estimate suggests it would require constructing around 216 new soft-sided detention facilities, each holding 500 beds every single year for 11 years straight.
So it's not just operating costs. It's this enormous continuous construction project just for detention space.
Exactly. And that's just detention. The court system isn't currently equipped to handle cases at that rate either. The sources estimate needing to establish over 1,000 new immigration courtrooms just to process 1 million cases per year.
That really shows the scale isn't just about apprehending people, is it? It's building the entire infrastructure of detention, legal processing to handle them at an unprecedented speed. And then I assume there are costs for the actual physical removal, the transportation itself.
Right. The sources give average estimated costs per person for different phases. Detention is estimated at over $278 per person per day. Sorry, I misspoke earlier saying year. And it's higher for families. Legal processing is estimated around $1,700 per case.
Okay.
And then you get to the physical removals. They give examples of average removal costs by air. Over $4,700 to send someone to the Philippines, maybe $1,500 to Venezuela by air. Costs to Mexico are lower, often by land or shorter flights.
And that brings up another practical challenge the sources mention, right? The difficulty of actually physically removing individuals to certain places. They talk about recalcitrant countries.
Yeah, that's a huge logistical hurdle. These are countries that restrict or sometimes outright ban repatriation flights from the U.S.
So even if you have a deportation order.
Exactly. It raises a big question about the feasibility of removal. Countries like Venezuela, Mauritania, China, India, they're cited as examples where removing individuals can be difficult or maybe even currently impossible because their governments restrict returns. You need a destination country willing and able to accept the person.
Okay, so the logistical hurdles and the fiscal costs, according to these reports, are just enormous. But what about the broader ripple effects? What do the sources say about the potential economic and social impacts of deporting millions of people?
This is where the American Immigration Council and the Urban Institute reports provide some really significant data points. The estimated impact on the U.S. economy, specifically on GDP, is substantial. The reports suggest a loss of somewhere between 4.2% and 6.8% annually.
Wait, a loss of 4.2 to 6.8% of GDP?
Yeah.
Annually. How does that compare?
Well, to put that in perspective, the sources compare that range to the GDP contraction we saw during the Great Recession, which was around 4.3%.
So the reports are suggesting the economic impact could be on par with a major recession.
Precisely. In 2022 dollars, that translates to a loss of $1.1 trillion to $1.7 trillion every year. It's just a massive economic hit projected by these analyses.
And how would this play out in the workforce?
Well, the sources highlight a major impact on the labor market. They note that nearly 90% of undocumented immigrants are working age, and they have a very high labor force participation rate.
So removing them would mean?
Removing them, the reports argue, would significantly worsen existing labor shortages across a whole range of industries. It could potentially cripple some sectors.
And do they get specific about which industries would be hit hardest?
They do. Construction and agriculture could lose at least 1 in 8 workers. Hospitality, maybe 1 in 14. And in specific trades, the projected losses are even higher. Things like plasterers, roofers, painters could lose over 30% of their workforce.
Wow.
And graders and sorters of agriculture products, nearly 28%. These are vital jobs in vital sectors.
The reports also mention entrepreneurs.
Right. Yes, they point to the loss of undocumented immigrant entrepreneurs. There are an estimated 1 million of them, and they generated over $27 billion in business income back in 2022. This includes, over 150,000 in neighborhood businesses, the kind that provide local services and jobs.
And what about contributions to public funds? I mean, undocumented households do pay taxes.
A significant amount, yes. The sources detail this. In 2022 alone, according to these reports, undocumented households paid $46.8 billion in federal taxes and another $29.3 billion in state and local taxes.
That's substantial.
It is. And they also contributed heavily to Social Security, $22.6 billion, and Medicare, $5.7 billion. The sources argue these contributions are actually crucial for the solvency of these programs, especially as the U.S. population gets older. Removing these contributors would shrink the funding base.
Beyond the pure economic numbers, though, there's the human costs, the impact on families. The sources report that deporting undocumented immigrants would directly separate 4 million mixed-status families.
And critically, that separation wouldn't just affect the person deported. It would directly impact 8.5 million U.S. citizens, including 5.1 million children.
These are families where some members are citizens or have legal status, and others are undocumented.
Exactly. And the reports estimate that the household income for these mixed-status families could be just slashed by an average of nearly 63%. That translates to a loss of about $51,000 per year per family. It's a massive disruption to the lives and economic stability of millions of U.S. citizens.
And the Urban Institute specifically connects this potential workforce loss to something else critical, the housing crisis.
Right. They note that immigrants made up over 23% of the construction workforce in 2023, and roughly half of those workers are estimated to be undocumented.
So losing that many construction workers
would seriously hinder our ability to build the housing units the U.S. desperately needs, which, the report suggests, could worsen the housing shortage and drive up costs for everyone.
And finally, the sources touch on the broader social climate, don't they? The fear and instability.
Yes, they report documented fear and instability within immigrant communities. Groups like Clinic and the First 100 Days analysis suggest this leads some people to withdraw from public life, even from using essential services.
And the Pew data we mentioned earlier kind of backs this up. It showed that 19% of all U.S. adults worried that they, a family member, or a close friend could be deported.
And that figure jumps dramatically to 42% among Hispanic adults. So the reports are painting a picture of a really multifaceted impact: economic output, specific industries, government revenue, and the very fabric of families and communities.
Okay, let's quickly touch on just a few other significant enforcement actions and legal challenges that are highlighted in the sources, particularly from that First 100 Days analysis and other reports.
Yeah.
Beyond just interior removals, there are apparently plans to significantly expand the detention system itself.
Yes, the plans reportedly aim to double the current capacity, maybe reaching 50,000 beds daily by April 2025. And there's talk of seeking funding for up to 100,000 daily beds, needing potentially $45 billion over 2 years for that expansion.
How will they do that?
It involves things like reopening family detention centers, repurposing military installations, signing these huge multi-billion-dollar contracts. However, the sources also note that reports of overcrowding and inadequate care are already emerging from the existing facilities, raising questions about expanding so rapidly.
And the immigration court system itself seems to be facing massive challenges and changes. There's that record backlog, right? Currently over 3.6 million cases.
Yeah, and the sources detail actions like the reported firing of immigration court personnel, including judges, and moves to reduce the size or influence of the Board of Immigration Appeals. Critics, as reported in the sources, express real concern that removing experienced judges just worsens the backlog and threatens due process for people whose futures hang in the balance.
There's also mention of a directive encouraging judges to dismiss asylum claims without full hearings, relying just on the written application.
Right. And the criticism there, according to the sources, is that this dramatically increases the risk of making mistakes of erroneous removals, particularly for asylum seekers who don't have a lawyer, to help them navigate that really complex process.
What about other actions? I remember reading about data sharing.
Ah, yes, the IRS-ICE data sharing agreement. It reportedly grants ICE real-time access to taxpayer information. The sources indicate this data is then used to identify potential targets for removal.
And the concern there.
Advocates, as reported, warn this could seriously deter tax compliance among mixed-status families who might fear the data being used against them. It could also further destabilize those families. Some sources even mention top IRS officials reportedly resigning in protest over this agreement.
And the Social Security Administration.
Also involved, reportedly, taking action to revoke Social Security numbers for migrants flagged by ICE using something called the ineligible master file. The sources note this cuts off access to really crucial things like banking, credit, and other benefits tied to having a valid SSN.
The reports also cover actions targeting people with temporary statuses, like parole or TPS.
Yes, aggressive actions or plans regarding those. For instance, reports of revoking parole for maybe 985,000 people who use the CBP One app with instructions to leave immediately, and efforts to revoke temporary protected status, or TPS, for groups like Venezuelans and Haitians.
But those face legal challenges.
Often, yes. The sources note that federal judges have stepped in sometimes, issuing injunctions like the one blocking the effort to revoke TPS for Venezuelans. So these actions don't always go uncontested legally.
There was also that program using AI to monitor social media.
Right, catch and revoke. Reportedly using AI to monitor social media activity of student visa holders. The sources noted nearly 1,500 visas were revoked by mid-April 2025 under this program.
That sounds like it would impact universities.
Indeed. Reports mention negative impacts on American higher education, though it's worth noting the sources also added that the administration later indicated it would reverse those specific revocations and maybe explore a different system.
And finally, two big executive orders mentioned. One on birthright citizenship.
Yeah, an executive order reportedly aimed at ending birthright citizenship by reinterpreting the 14th Amendment. However, the sources quickly point out this has been blocked by multiple federal courts across the country.
It's tied up in legal battles.
Definitely. It was scheduled for expedited review by the Supreme Court in late April 2025, according to the sources, highlighting just how contested that is.
And the other EEO on language.
An executive order declaring English the official language and revoking requirements for multilingual federal services. But while framed as significant by some, the sources seem to indicate its practical impact might be limited because of existing laws and constitutional protections around language access.
Okay, so what's clear from that section is just the sheer breadth of changes being proposed or attempted, touching so many different legal categories, government agencies, and often running straight into significant legal challenges.
Absolutely. It's a very active and contested space.
Okay, wow. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground in this deep dive. We've looked at, these ambitious stated goals for increasing enforcement in deportations, compare them to historical numbers.
We examined the mixed public opinions, those deep partisan divides on where enforcement should even happen.
Delved into the really significant estimated fiscal and economic costs of trying to implement mass deportations on that scale.
Explored the profound social consequences, things like family separation and the documented fear in communities.
And it just touched on a whole range of other operational and legal challenges highlighted across these different sources.
Yeah, and what this all means, I think, as presented in these sources, is that this topic is just incredibly complex. There are so many layers, right? You've got high-level policy goals, legal interpretations.
Running up against ground-level logistics, economic dependencies, and these deeply personal family impacts.
Exactly. And no single perspective that we found in these sources really captures the full picture. You have these stated enforcement goals clashing with logistical, fiscal, economic, and social realities that are estimated to be, frankly, enormous. Plus, you have existing legal frameworks and very divided public sentiment.
So here's maybe something for you, the listener, to keep thinking about as these developments unfold and are discussed. Consider how the tension between the stated goals for drastically increased enforcement, especially interior deportations on a massive scale, and the substantial logistical, fiscal, economic, and social realities that are revealed in these various reports, how that tension shapes the ongoing debate here in the U.S.
Yeah, how it impacts different communities and how it raises these really fundamental questions about balancing enforcement priorities with things like economic stability, social cohesion, and our established legal structures.
It's definitely a dynamic space, and these reports certainly provide a lot to consider.